Good morning, team. Let's review our growth strategy. As you can see, our Q3 projections are very promising. Your input is welcome.
There is a kind of silence that only comes after everything has already fallen apart. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of rest. Not the silence you feel on a Sunday morning when the coffee is hot and the world outside has not yet asked anything of you. This is a different kind of silence entirely. This is the silence of a house that used to be full of life, full of noise, full of the particular and irreplaceable sounds that belong to one specific family and no other, the sounds of a woman moving through her kitchen before sunrise, of a daughter laughing too loudly at something on her phone, of a life in motion that had been built carefully and deliberately and with enormous personal cost over the span of 2 full decades. And then one night, all of that went quiet. Not gradually. Not with warning. Quiet in the way that only happens when something has been taken rather than simply lost. This story begins the way so many of the most devastating stories do, not with violence, not with shouting, not with any of the dramatic signals we have been trained by television and film to watch for. It begins with love. Or at least with something that presented itself so convincingly as love that the people closest to this family saw nothing to question for years. A man. A woman. A daughter. A company worth millions of dollars that one person had built from the ground up with nothing but determination and intelligence and an absolute refusal to accept that the world owed her less than she was capable of creating. And a plan, cold, premeditated, financially motivated, and executed over a period of years, that when it finally came to light did not just shock a neighborhood or a city. It became the kind of story that people repeated to each other across states and countries because it contained something that purely factual reporting could never fully capture. It contained the specific, unbearable weight of what it feels like to learn that someone you trusted completely had been calculating against you the entire time. But here is the thing. Here is the detail that changes everything about how this story lands. The woman at the center of it was not simply a victim, though she was that too in the most final and irreversible sense. She was also, in the quietest possible way, the most prepared person in the entire story. She had seen something coming. She had not known exactly what it was or exactly when it would arrive. But she had felt it the way certain people feel weather before the clouds appear, a change in pressure, a shift in the quality of the air, something that the body understands before the mind has caught up. And she had acted on that feeling in a way that was methodical and legally precise and ultimately more powerful than anything her husband had planned. He thought he had won. He had not won. He had walked directly into the outcome she had prepared for him. She just never got to be there when it arrived. Before we go any further into this story, we want to take a moment to connect with everyone who is watching right now, because this community means everything to us and we read every single comment that comes through on this channel. So right now, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Whether you are in Atlanta or Chicago or somewhere in the UK or across Canada or watching from Nigeria or Jamaica or anywhere else on this planet, we genuinely want to hear from you. And if you are new here and this is the first video of ours you have found, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications because we bring you stories like this one regularly and you do not want to find out after the fact that you missed one. This channel exists because of the people who watch it, who share it, who take time out of their day to tell us that a story stayed with them. So thank you for being here. Now let us get into it, because this story has layers that we are going to unfold carefully and deliberately over the next 2 hours, and every single layer matters. There are 3 questions at the absolute center of everything you are about to hear, and we are asking you to hold all 3 of them in your mind simultaneously as this story develops, because the way they connect to each other is itself part of what makes this case so extraordinary. The first question is the one that sits at the foundation of the entire story, and it is this. How does a man who stood at an altar and made promises in front of the people he loved most arrive, years later, at a place where the woman he made those promises to becomes, in his mind, not a partner, not a person, not the mother of his child, but simply an obstacle? An inconvenient structural problem standing between him and the financial outcome he has decided he deserves. How does that transformation happen, and how does it happen in such a way that the people around him never fully see it until it is too late to matter? The second question is perhaps even more remarkable given everything that follows. How does a woman who is building a company, raising a daughter, managing a marriage that is quietly deteriorating, and carrying all of the ordinary and extraordinary pressures of a life fully lived, how does that woman find the clarity and the courage and the sheer organizational precision to do what Diana Calloway did? To prepare in silence. To protect without announcing. To put every important thing beyond the reach of someone who was already planning to take it, and to do all of that without confrontation, without drama, and without ever letting on that she knew what was happening. And the third question, the one that is hardest to sit with, the one that does not have a satisfying answer no matter how long you turn it over, is simply this. What does it mean when a woman's greatest act of love and protection for her daughter happens in the final chapter of her own life, and she never gets to know that it worked? To understand this story in the way it deserves to be understood, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the crime, and not the beginning of the marriage. We have to go back further than that. We have to go back to a woman who did not yet exist as the person this story is about, who was still in the process of becoming her. Diana Marie Calloway was born on the 9th of March, 1971, in Columbus, Ohio, in a neighborhood on the south side of the city that was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors by name and left their doors unlocked and measured success not in net worth but in whether the bills got paid and the children got fed and the family stayed together through whatever the year decided to throw at them. Her father, James, was a man who drove a delivery truck for a regional distribution company for 31 years without once calling in sick, a fact that his colleagues apparently regarded as somewhere between impressive and slightly unnerving. Her mother, Ruth, worked the early shift at a diner on the corner of two streets that Diana would be able to describe in precise detail decades later because she walked past them every single morning on her way to school, past the smell of eggs and coffee and the sound of her mother's voice through the window calling out orders with the particular confidence of someone who had done the same thing 1,000 times and was going to do it 1,000 more. They were not a wealthy family. They were not even a comfortable family in the way that word is sometimes used to mean something just short of wealthy. They were a family that understood money as a practical reality rather than an aspiration, that understood work as the thing you did not because it was fulfilling or meaningful in some larger philosophical sense but because if you did not do it the rent did not get paid and the lights got turned off and those were outcomes that were not acceptable. Diana absorbed all of this. She absorbed it the way children absorb the things they see repeated every day before they are old enough to have decided what they think about them. And what she took from it, what she carried forward from a childhood that gave her very little in material terms but gave her something that cannot be purchased or inherited, was a bone-deep understanding that nothing was going to come to her unless she went and got it herself. Her teachers at Jefferson Elementary School on the south side of Columbus remembered Diana as a student who existed in a category that is genuinely rare and that most teachers encounter only a handful of times across an entire career. She was not simply bright, though she was certainly that. She was relentlessly, almost uncomfortably curious in the specific way that makes the adults around a child slightly unsettled because they sense that the questions are not going to stop and that they are going to get harder before they get easier. She stayed after class voluntarily. Not because she was struggling with the material, which she never was. But because she wanted more of it. She wanted to know what came next and what connected to what and why the rules worked the way they did and what happened when the rules were applied to situations the textbook had not thought to cover. Her 6th grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Howard, said in an interview given many years after Diana's death that she had kept a note that Diana had passed to her during class one afternoon asking whether it was possible to start a business before you were legally allowed to sign a contract, and whether there was a way around that. Mrs. Howard said she had laughed at the time, but that she had also looked up the answer before the next class because she had known, even then, that Diana Calloway was not asking hypothetically. High school did not slow her down. If anything, it focused her in ways that the more open structure of elementary school had not been able to. She ran the student business club by her junior year. She organized a fundraising drive for the school library that raised 3 times its target by methods that the administration was slightly uncomfortable with but could not technically object to because everything Diana had done was within the rules, just further within the rules than anyone had thought to go. Her guidance counselor, a Mr. Raymond Ellis, gave an interview in the years following the trial that became one of the most quoted pieces of testimony in every long-form account of Diana's life. He said that Diana Calloway was the kind of young woman who walked into every room as though she had already decided she belonged there, and that the only question she was ever actually working on in any given situation was how quickly she could bring the rest of the room up to speed on that fact. He said he told her that once, as a compliment, and that she had looked at him for a moment and then said, "I know," like it was the least surprising thing anyone had ever said to her. He said he had been slightly taken aback at the time, but that in retrospect it was the most accurate self-assessment he had ever heard from a 17-year-old. She applied to Ohio State University with a scholarship application that her guidance counselor said was the best he had seen from a student at that school in his entire career. She received a partial academic scholarship and supplemented it with 2 part-time jobs, waiting tables on Friday and Saturday evenings at a family restaurant off campus and babysitting for 3 different families on a rotating basis during the week. She did not complain about this arrangement. She did not describe it in the way that some people describe their difficult early years, as hardship to be survived. She described it, in the rare moments she talked about it at all, as practice. Practice for what she was going to build. Practice for the years when she would be the one employing people rather than the one showing up in the uniform and taking the orders. She graduated from Ohio State in 1993 with a degree in business administration and a grade point average that placed her in the top 7% of her class. She attended her graduation ceremony alone because her parents could not take the day off work, and she has described, in an interview she gave to a regional business magazine in 2009 that her friends and colleagues later described as one of the most honest things she ever said publicly, that she stood in line waiting to cross the stage and looked around at the families in the bleachers with their signs and their cameras and their flowers and felt not sadness exactly but a sharpening. A clarification of purpose. A very clear and quiet understanding that the only person who was going to be in her corner at the moments that mattered was herself, and that this was not a tragedy but simply a fact that needed to be organized around. She went to work immediately after graduation at a mid-sized marketing and communications firm in downtown Columbus called Henderson and Morse Associates. She was hired as a junior account coordinator at a salary that she later described as just enough to keep her from having to ask anyone for anything, which was the only financial metric she actually cared about at that stage of her life. She learned the business with the same systematic thoroughness she had brought to everything else. She stayed late not to impress her managers but because there was always more to learn, and the office was quieter after 6 when the people who were working for paychecks had gone home, and she could move through the files and the records and the client histories without anyone looking over her shoulder. She spent 4 years at Henderson and Morse. She left with a thorough working knowledge of how a marketing business operated at every level, from client acquisition through campaign delivery through billing and retention. She also left with something more valuable than any of the technical knowledge. She left with relationships. With clients who had come to trust her specifically rather than simply the firm she represented. With colleagues who respected her. With a network that she had built not through socializing or strategic glad-handing but through the simple and ultimately more durable method of doing what she said she was going to do, every time, without exception. She was 27 years old in the spring of 1998 when she sat down at a second-hand desk in the spare bedroom of her apartment in the Clintonville neighborhood of Columbus and incorporated Calloway Creative Solutions. She had 2 clients already committed before she officially opened. She had a business plan that she had been working on for 8 months. She had a savings account that would cover 6 months of operating costs if nothing went as planned, which she considered a more than acceptable runway because she intended things to go as planned. The company name was deliberate and considered. She had thought about something more neutral, something that did not attach her name so directly to the enterprise, and she had ultimately rejected that approach because she wanted every client, every employee, every person who came into contact with her business to understand from the first moment exactly who was accountable for everything that happened inside it. Her name. Her standard. Her responsibility. The phone started ringing within the first month at a volume that surprised even her, which says something meaningful about the network she had built and the reputation she had established during her 4 years at Henderson and Morse. By the end of the first year she had 9 active clients, revenues that exceeded her most optimistic projections, and the beginning of a waiting list. By the end of the second year she had hired her first employee, a young woman named Teresa who had recently graduated and who Diana paid 30% more than the industry entry-level standard because she had decided very early on that the kind of talent she wanted to build a company around was not the kind of talent that stayed somewhere for the salary they were offered on day one. By the time Diana turned 32 she had moved Callaway Creative Solutions out of her spare bedroom and into a proper commercial lease in a building on the east side of Columbus's business district. She had 18 employees. She had a client list that included 3 regional corporations, 2 national brands with Ohio operations, and a growing roster of mid-sized businesses that had come to her through referrals from existing clients, which she always considered the only form of marketing that actually mattered. The culture she built inside that company was something that people who worked there described in strikingly consistent terms across every interview that was ever conducted about the business, regardless of when they had worked there or what their role had been. They described a place that was demanding without being punishing. A place where high standards were maintained not through fear but through the example that came from the top. A place where Diana Callaway was present in the particular way that leaders who have built something from nothing are always present, not hovering, not micromanaging, but genuinely and specifically engaged with the work in a way that communicated to everyone around her that nothing that happened inside those walls was too small to matter to her personally. One senior account manager who worked for Diana for 11 years told a journalist in 2016 that the thing she remembered most vividly about Diana as a boss was not any single decision or any single act of generosity or any particular professional achievement. It was the way Diana listened. She said that when Diana was in a conversation with you, there was no part of her attention that was somewhere else. She was entirely present. She heard everything. And she remembered everything she heard, which was sometimes uncomfortable if you had said something careless but was more often simply the feeling of being taken seriously by someone whose opinion of you genuinely mattered. Diana met Robert Calloway for the first time in the autumn of 2001 at a business networking event held at a hotel in downtown Columbus. He was in commercial real estate. He was 41 years old, tall, well-dressed in the way that suggests familiarity with comfort rather than the slightly effortful presentation of someone performing a version of themselves they have not yet fully grown into. He was charming in an easy, unforced way that Diana, who spent most of her professional life in rooms full of people performing various versions of themselves, found genuinely refreshing. He had a sense of humor that was dry and well-timed and that did not require anyone else to be smaller in order to work. He was interested in what she had to say in a way that felt, to Diana, less like networking strategy and more like actual curiosity. She was 30 years old. She had spent nearly the entirety of her 20s inside the work of building something real, and she had been so fully absorbed by that work for so long that the particular experience of someone being interested in her specifically, rather than in what she had built or what she could professionally offer, was something she had not had much occasion to feel recently. It was disarming. It was meant to be, though whether Robert knew that consciously or whether he was simply a naturally charming man is one of the questions that this story does not fully resolve. They dated for 2 years. Long enough that the people who knew Diana well had time to assess Robert carefully and to form opinions that they largely kept to themselves because Diana seemed genuinely happy and happiness was not something her friends felt they had any business complicating. He integrated into her life with what seemed like ease. He was attentive without being possessive. He was interested in her company without being competitive about it. He came to dinners with her friends and held his own in conversations and did not embarrass himself or her in any of the ways that previous men in her life had managed to embarrass themselves. They married in April of 2003 in a small outdoor ceremony in a garden venue outside Columbus. 43 guests. Simple flowers. A meal that Diana had personally selected because she had very clear ideas about what a meal should taste like and was not interested in compromising them for the sake of a catering package. Their daughter Madison was born in October of 2004, 18 months after the wedding, and the arrival of Madison Lee Calloway changed the internal geography of Diana's life in a way that she described, in that 2009 magazine interview, as the only thing that had ever genuinely surprised her. She said she had known intellectually that having a child would change everything. She said that knowing a thing intellectually and then experiencing the actual weight of it in your arms at 2 in the morning while your whole understanding of what matters quietly reorganizes itself around one sleeping face are two entirely different categories of experience, and that no amount of business planning or personal preparation had given her anything close to adequate readiness for the second one. The years between Madison's birth and 2008 were, by almost every measure available, good years for the Calloway family. Robert was a present and genuinely engaged father in the early years. He coached Madison's soccer team when she was 7 and 8 years old with a consistency and enthusiasm that her teammates' parents commented on approvingly. He attended school plays and recitals and science fairs and parent-teacher conferences. He and Diana appeared at neighborhood events and professional functions and family gatherings as the kind of couple that prompts no concerns and generates no gossip, two people who had built something together and were visibly comfortable in that construction. Diana's company continued to grow. She survived the 2008 financial crisis not merely intact but in a genuinely stronger competitive position than before it, which she accomplished through a combination of the conservative financial reserve she had always maintained, a willingness to hold on to her staff through the worst of it rather than shedding people at the first sign of pressure, and the kind of client loyalty that only accumulates when you have spent years being the kind of partner that clients do not want to lose even when they are looking for things to cut. When the recovery came, Calloway Creative Solutions was positioned to move quickly because it had not spent the crisis dismantling itself. By 2010 the company had 51 employees. By 2012 that number had grown to 64, revenues had crossed into the multi-millions, and Diana Calloway had been named in 3 separate regional business publications as one of the most significant women in Ohio's business community. She was, on paper and in practice, one of the most successful self-made entrepreneurs in Central Ohio. She knew it and she was not uncomfortable with knowing it, though she wore the success in the specific way of someone who has never had the luxury of confusing achievement with security and who understands, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that the thing you have built is only as permanent as your willingness to keep building it every single day. She did not rest on what Calloway Creative Solutions had become. She pushed it forward. She took on new clients that challenged her team in directions they had not previously gone. She invested in the development of her staff. She mentored young women in business at the university level and at the community level, and she did it not as a branding exercise but because she understood, from the inside, what it had meant to her to not have anyone doing that for her, and she was determined to be something different for the people coming behind her. Madison was growing up inside all of this. Growing up watching her mother at work in the most literal sense, she spent countless hours in Diana's office through elementary and middle school, doing homework at a small desk that Diana had set up for her in the corner, absorbing without necessarily understanding yet what she was absorbing, the sight of a woman who treated her work as something that mattered, who treated the people who worked for her as something that mattered, and who treated herself as someone whose time and judgment and effort were worth exactly as much as the outcomes they produced. Diana was deliberate about this. She wanted Madison to see it. Not to pressure her, not to groom her for a specific future, but because she believed that children become what they have seen as possible, and she wanted Madison's sense of what was possible to be as wide and as grounded in reality as she could make it. By the time Madison reached high school she was, by the accounts of everyone who knew her, a genuinely extraordinary young person. Sharp, organized, emotionally attuned in ways that teenagers are often not, and possessed of a clarity about what she valued and why that most adults spend decades trying to arrive at. She and Diana had the kind of relationship that people who knew them both described as something rarer than closeness. It was a relationship built on mutual respect between two people who happened to also be mother and daughter, which is a more unusual thing than it sounds, because respect of that kind between a parent and a teenager requires the parent to see the child as a person with real perceptions and real judgment rather than simply someone who requires management until they are old enough to be left alone. Now we turn to Robert. And this is the part of the story that requires the most care in the telling, because the temptation when talking about a man who did what Robert Calloway did is to make him into a monster from the beginning, to reach back into the story of his life and find the early signals and present them as inevitable markers on a predetermined road. We are going to resist that temptation because we think it is dishonest and because it lets the people who loved him off a hook they deserve to hold for a moment. Robert Calloway was not, for the first decade of his marriage to Diana, a man that anyone around him would have described as someone to be afraid of. He was not violent. He was not openly controlling. He was not cruel in any of the ways that are easy to name. He was a man who had built a comfortable professional life in commercial real estate, not spectacular, not the kind of career that generates profile pieces or industry awards, but solid, competent, adequately lucrative. He had a social ease that served him well in professional contexts and a personal warmth that, for a long time, appeared genuine because it was expressed in ways that felt spontaneous rather than performed. The people who attended the same dinner parties as Robert and Diana in the early years of their marriage consistently described him as good company. Funny. Generous with compliments. Good at making people feel that he was glad they were there. What was happening beneath that presentation during the years between approximately 2009 and 2013 is something that only became fully visible in retrospect, when the financial investigators hired as part of the criminal case began pulling apart Robert's records with the specific intention of understanding not just what he had done but when he had started deciding to do it. What they found was a timeline that told a story of gradual and accelerating financial deterioration that Robert had worked very hard to keep entirely invisible to Diana. It had started with what might be charitably described as overconfidence, 2 investment opportunities that Robert had entered into in 2009 with partners he had met through professional contacts, ventures that he had funded using personal capital he had accumulated over the years and that he had chosen not to mention to Diana because he considered his personal finances to be a separate matter from their shared household and because, at the time, he had expected both investments to perform well. They did not perform well. One collapsed entirely within 18 months. The other limped along in a way that consumed additional capital trying to stabilize before it too became unsalvageable. By 2011, Robert had lost a significant portion of his personal savings. He had also, in the course of trying to manage those losses, accumulated debts through personal loans that he had been careful to take in structures that would not appear on any shared account statement or trigger any conversation that Diana might initiate. This is where the story of Robert's finances becomes not just a story of bad luck or poor judgment but a story of deliberate concealment that tells us something important about the way he had come to understand his relationship with Diana. He did not tell her. He had multiple opportunities to tell her, moments in their marriage when a different man, a man who understood that partnership requires transparency even when transparency is humiliating, would have said what was happening and accepted the consequences of honesty. He chose concealment every single time. He chose it not once in a moment of panic and then corrected course, but repeatedly, systematically, as a sustained strategy across years. And what that tells us, the investigators and attorneys who worked this case consistently noted, is that by at least 2011 Robert had already made a fundamental internal decision about the nature of his relationship with Diana. He had decided that she was not his partner in the full sense. She was his resource. She was the mechanism through which he maintained the life he wanted to maintain. And she was, therefore, someone to be managed rather than someone to be honest with. The request for an equity stake in Callaway Creative Solutions came in October of 2013 and it was not, as Robert framed it, a spontaneous suggestion or a natural evolution of their partnership. It was the product of months of calculation. Robert had consulted, without Diana's knowledge, with a financial advisor who had helped him model out what a formal equity stake in Diana's company would be worth at various valuations and under various scenarios including the scenario of divorce and the scenario of spousal inheritance. He had run the numbers. He knew exactly what he was asking for and exactly what it would represent if he obtained it. When he sat down with Diana and presented his proposal, he did so with documents that had been prepared in advance and a framing that had been carefully considered to make the ask sound reasonable and organic rather than strategic. Diana listened to all of it. She asked questions that were, according to the attorney she consulted afterward, exactly the right questions. She took the documents and she said she would review them. And she did review them, with an attorney who took one look at the structure Robert was proposing and identified immediately that it was not, as presented, a simple formalizing of partnership but a mechanism that, if executed, would give Robert legally defensible claims on the company in the event of divorce or death. Diana declined the request. She did it with the same calm precision she brought to every professional decision, offering Robert an alternative role in the company that gave him involvement without ownership, framing the refusal in structural and legal terms that made it difficult for him to push back on without revealing the actual motivation behind the ask. Robert accepted her answer. He went home and he sat with it, and something changed in him in the days and weeks that followed that refusal, something that the people who knew this family noticed even if they could not name it at the time. He became quieter. More interior. He was present in the house in a physical sense but less present in any other sense. Diana described it to Carol Jenkins in a phone call that Carol later recounted in detail. She said Robert had become like someone who was in the middle of working something out in a language she did not speak, and she could see him thinking but could not hear what the thought was. She said she was not certain whether she was afraid of the thought or simply afraid of how quiet it was. Carol told her she was probably reading too much into it. Diana said she did not think she was. She was right. What happened in the 18 months between Robert's rejected proposal in late 2013 and the spring of 2015 was something that Diana's attorney later described as one of the most methodical and sophisticated examples of personal legal self-protection she had encountered in over 20 years of family law practice. Diana did not go to the police. She did not have anything concrete enough to take to the police, and she knew it. She did not confront Robert. She did not give him any indication that she was watching him more carefully, that her instincts had sharpened, that the feelings she had been carrying for 2 years had crossed some internal threshold from vague discomfort into something she was organizing her actions around. She simply began, quietly and without fanfare, to do what she had always done when she sensed that a situation required preparation before it required response. She prepared. She went through every account, every share structure, every legal document connected to Calloway Creative Solutions with her attorney. She changed passwords and access credentials on every system Robert had any connection to. She updated every beneficiary designation. She moved accounts. She documented everything she moved and why she moved it and when. She created a paper trail that was not designed to be used against Robert. There was nothing to use against him at that point, but that was designed to make absolutely clear, in any legal context that might arise, exactly what belonged to her and exactly how it had been structured and exactly when those structures had been put in place. And then, on the 14th of March, 2015, Diana Calloway sat in her attorney's office with a second attorney present as a witness and a financial planner who had helped architect the structure she was about to execute, and she signed the documents that transferred full legal ownership of Calloway Creative Solutions to her daughter. Madison Calloway. 17 years old. A junior in high school. The sole and absolute legal owner of a company that employed 64 people, held contracts with dozens of clients, and represented 20 years of her mother's life. The structure was not a simple transfer. It was built with the specific intention of being unassailable. 2 attorneys had reviewed it. A third had been brought in to identify any weaknesses in the approach. Every element had been considered and addressed. Robert could not contest it. He could not claim it was made under duress because there was no duress. Diana was in excellent health, had full legal capacity, and had conducted the transfer through a firm he had no connection to and no advance knowledge of. He could not claim it was fraudulent because it was straightforwardly what it appeared to be, a mother placing her life's work in her daughter's name for reasons that any court in the country would recognize as legally valid and personally unimpeachable. He could not inherit it because it was not in Diana's estate. It had not been in Diana's estate for months before the night she died. Madison owned it. Completely. Without condition. And Robert had no idea any of it had happened. Diana told Madison only what she needed to know at the time. She told her that she was restructuring the company's ownership for long-term planning purposes and that having Madison as the legal owner was the right structure for protecting the business and its employees over the long term. Madison was 17 and she trusted her mother in the specific and total way that comes from years of watching someone operate with integrity in every context. She signed where she was told to sign. She asked a few questions that Diana answered carefully and partially. She did not ask the question that her mother was not yet ready to answer, whether this had anything to do with her father, whether Diana was afraid of something, whether the quiet in the house had a specific cause that Madison had been sensing without naming for longer than she had admitted to herself. That conversation never happened. Diana intended to have it when Madison was a little older, when the divorce she was planning for early 2016 was behind them, when she could sit down with her daughter and explain everything from the beginning in a way that served Madison's understanding rather than Diana's immediate need for her daughter not to be frightened. She never got to have it. The timing was not hers to control in the end. The fall of 2015 looked, from the outside, like any other autumn in the Calloway household. Diana and Robert attended a neighborhood gathering in early October and were pleasant to their hosts and to the other guests and left at a reasonable hour and drove home in a car that contained between them a silence that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. Diana had a meeting scheduled with a divorce attorney in January. She had told Carol about this meeting. She had not told anyone else. She had not told Madison, not yet. She was managing the timing carefully because she knew that the divorce was going to be complicated, not financially, because she had spent 2 years making sure that the financial complication was minimized, but emotionally, for Madison, who was 17 and who had grown up calling Robert her father and who would need to process the collapse of that relationship in her own time and in her own way. Diana was thinking about all of this. She was thinking about it every day. She was thinking about it on the evening of November 14, 2015, a Friday, when Madison left for a friend's house with her overnight bag over her shoulder and turned back at the end of the front path to wave at her mother in the doorway, which was something she always did, a small habit of departure that Diana had always loved. Diana waved back. That was the last time Madison saw her mother standing in that doorway. It was the last time either of them knew that both of them were safe. Neighbors on the street reported a quiet Friday evening. No sounds from the Calloway house that distinguished it from any other Friday evening in any other year. The houses on either side registered nothing. The street was still. Whatever happened inside those walls on the night of November 14 happened without the kind of noise or disruption that filters through walls and causes neighbors to look up from their televisions. By Saturday morning the house was exactly as quiet as it had been the night before. Robert's car was in the driveway. Diana's car was in the garage. A neighbor walking her dog at 7 in the morning noted nothing unusual. At 9 in the morning Carol Jenkins called Diana's cell phone from her own kitchen while she was making coffee, planning to finalize plans for a lunch they had tentatively discussed. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. This was not immediately alarming. Diana sometimes left her phone in her office on weekends and did not check messages until the afternoon. Carol left a brief message and went about her morning. She called again at 2 in the afternoon. Voicemail again. She sent a text. The text showed as delivered but not read. At 6 in the evening she called once more, and when the voicemail picked up she sat for a moment in her kitchen with the phone in her hand, feeling something she could not quite name but that she would later describe as the specific sensation of a silence that is louder than it should be. She drove to the house the following day, Sunday, in the late afternoon. She rang the bell. Robert answered. He was wearing weekend clothes, jeans, a pullover, and his expression when he opened the door was composed in a way that Carol, who had known this family for years and who knew how Robert looked in various states of emotion, registered as slightly off without being able to say precisely what was off about it. He told her Diana had made a spontaneous decision Friday evening to drive to Cincinnati to see a client who was dealing with a situation that needed in-person attention, that it was the kind of thing Diana did occasionally when a client relationship required it, and that she had probably been too immersed in the work to check her phone over the weekend. He said it all fluently and without hesitation. Carol thanked him. She got back in her car. She sat in the driveway for a moment. Then she called Diana's cell phone one more time from the car and listened to it go to voicemail and thought about the fact that Diana had never, in the 22 years they had been friends, been too immersed in anything to return a call within 24 hours. Diana was the most reliably communicative person Carol had ever known. It was one of the things her clients loved about her. It was one of the things everyone who knew her consistently noted. She returned messages. She did not disappear for weekends without telling anyone she was going to. Carol drove to the office Monday morning before she went to the police, because she wanted to be certain before she said something she could not take back. She walked into Callaway Creative Solutions and found the management team beginning their week with the particular organized energy that a company run by Diana Callaway tended to generate first thing Monday morning. She asked the operations director, a woman named Sandra who had been with the company for 7 years, whether she knew anything about Diana being in Cincinnati over the weekend for a client visit. Sandra's expression told Carol everything before the words did. Sandra said she had no knowledge of any Cincinnati visit. She said Diana had no clients in Cincinnati who would have required emergency in-person contact. She said Diana had a full schedule of meetings beginning Tuesday morning and had confirmed all of them the previous Thursday. She said Diana's personal items, her laptop, her spare set of office keys, a travel bag she kept in a closet specifically for unplanned overnight trips, were all exactly where they always were. She said she had assumed Diana was simply taking a rare quiet weekend. She said her voice, by the end of that exchange, had changed in a way that Carol recognized as the voice of someone beginning to understand that something is wrong. Carol went directly to the Columbus Police Department from the office. She sat across from a detective and she said the words that opened the investigation. She told him that her closest friend had been unreachable since Friday evening, that her car was at the family home, that her office had no knowledge of any trip, that her personal items had not been packed, and that the story her husband had offered did not fit anything she knew about the woman she had known for 22 years. The detective took her statement. He told her that he understood her concern and that they would follow up. He was, according to Carol, professional and measured in a way that she found simultaneously reassuring and insufficient. She drove home and she spent Monday night at her kitchen table with her phone in front of her, willing it to ring with Diana's voice on the other end. It did not ring with Diana's voice. It did not ring with anything that answered the question she was carrying. The police spoke to Robert on Monday afternoon. He received them at the front door and invited them in and offered them coffee and was cooperative in the precise and complete way that investigators later described in court as almost performative, not the cooperation of a man who is genuinely worried about his wife and wants to do everything possible to help find her, but the cooperation of a man who has prepared for this conversation and intends to manage it carefully. He provided the same account he had given Carol. He showed the detectives a text message from Diana's phone sent at 6:17 on Saturday morning that read, "Taking the weekend. Need some space. Don't worry." He showed it without being asked, which one detective noted in his initial report as worth returning to. The officers thanked Robert for his time and told him they would be in touch. In the car afterward, the two detectives sat for a moment before one of them said what both of them were thinking, which was that the phrasing of that text was wrong in a way that was difficult to specify but impossible to dismiss. Diana Callaway ran a communications company. She wrote for a living. And the message on that phone read like a note someone had written after consulting a template of what a woman who needs space might plausibly say rather than anything a real woman would actually text to a husband she was leaving for the weekend. Don't worry. In particular, struck both of them as the kind of thing you write when you are trying to preempt the response rather than because you actually expect it. The digital forensics unit was engaged within 48 hours of Carol's initial report. They requested cell tower data for Diana's phone number covering the period from Friday evening through Saturday morning. The request was processed and the results came back, and the lead detective sat with the results for a long moment before he picked up his phone and called his partner. The text message that Robert had presented as proof that Diana had left the house voluntarily on Saturday morning at 6:17 had been sent from a device that had not moved. The cell tower data placed Diana's phone within a radius that included the family home and did not include any road, any rest stop, any gas station, any point along any plausible route to Cincinnati or anywhere else. The phone had been inside the house when that message was sent. Diana Callaway had not sent it. She had not been awake to send it. She had not been standing in a hallway with her keys, making a spontaneous decision to take the weekend for herself. Someone else had sent it using her phone while she was already gone, already past the point where a text message could have done anything to describe her situation accurately. A search was organized. Robert was asked to come to the station for what was described as a follow-up conversation, the careful, procedural language that investigators use when they are no longer treating someone as a concerned spouse but have not yet moved them to the formal status that requires a different set of protocols. Robert came. He brought an attorney, which was his right and which the investigators noted without comment. He maintained the same account through the follow-up conversation that he had maintained throughout. He expressed concern about Diana. He said he hoped she was safe. He said he could not imagine why she would have left without telling him where she was going. He performed all of this with the smoothness of someone who has rehearsed it, and the investigators in that room recognized the performance for what it was even if they could not yet prove it. They released him. They continued building the case. And on the morning of November 19, 5 days after Diana had last been seen alive in the doorway of her own home waving goodbye to her daughter, a search team operating on the basis of cell tower data, vehicle GPS records pulled from Robert's car, and a gas station security camera receipt that placed him in a specific area at a specific time on the night of the 14th found Diana Calloway in a wooded area 31 miles from her home. She had not gone to Cincinnati. She had not needed space. She had been 30 minutes from filing for divorce, 3 months from watching her daughter turn 18, and 1 conversation away from finally telling Madison everything she had spent 2 years quietly making sure would not be taken from her. Robert Calloway was arrested on December 3, 2015. The case against him was built over the following months with the kind of methodical, layered care that the evidence warranted and that the prosecution recognized would need to be overwhelming given what Robert's defense team would certainly argue, that the financial motive was circumstantial, that the cell tower data was imprecise, that the GPS records had alternative explanations, that the gas station receipt proved proximity but not presence. The prosecution built around those potential arguments from the beginning. They brought in the digital forensics analysis of the text message in exhaustive detail. They brought in the GPS data from Robert's vehicle with expert testimony explaining its precision and its limitations. They brought in the gas station security camera footage that showed Robert's vehicle. They brought in the complete financial history, 5 years of concealed debts, failed investments, hidden loans, and the specific calculations Robert had made around the value of Diana's company as a spousal inheritance. They brought in Diana's attorney, who took the stand and spent 3 hours walking the jury through every step of what Diana had done with the company, when she had done it, and what legal effect those steps had on Robert's ability to claim anything connected to Calloway Creative Solutions. That testimony, the testimony about the company transfer, was, according to observers who were present for the trial, the moment at which the entire shape of the story shifted inside the courtroom. Because what the jury heard from that witness stand was not simply the story of a crime and its investigation. It was the story of a woman who had been smart enough and brave enough and organized enough to ensure that the crime, when it came, would fail at its actual purpose. Robert had planned the murder of his wife in order to inherit her company and pay his debts and rebuild his life on the foundation of everything she had spent 20 years creating. He had executed that plan. He had done the thing he had planned to do. And he had gotten nothing. The company was not his. It had never been his. It had been Madison's for 7 months before the night he committed the crime, and there was not a single legal argument he could make, not a single challenge he could mount, not a single claim he could file that had any chance of changing that outcome. Diana had been 7 months ahead of him. In the most important move of the entire story, she had already won before the contest had even started. The trial lasted 7 weeks. 41 witnesses. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned on the morning of the 3rd day with a verdict of guilty on all counts. The courtroom was full. Carol Jenkins was in the gallery. Sandra and several other senior employees of Calloway Creative Solutions were in the gallery. Madison Calloway was in the gallery, 18 years old now, sitting in a dark blazer with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the foreperson as the verdict was read aloud into a room so quiet that people who were present that day described being able to hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Robert sat at the defense table with his hands flat on the surface in front of him and his face composed in the way it had been composed throughout the trial, not the composure of innocence, which tends to look different, tends to have more anxiety underneath it, But the composure of someone who has decided that a certain presentation is the appropriate one and who is maintaining it through the discipline of long practice regardless of what is happening inside. When the verdict was read, something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. Not in the way that scenes like this are depicted in films. It was small. A slight loosening around the jaw. A change in the quality of the stillness. He was led from the courtroom without incident. 3 days after the verdict, Madison Calloway stood at a podium in that same courtroom and delivered a victim impact statement that people who were present that day have described, in the years since, as one of the most remarkable things they have ever heard in a courtroom. She was 18 years old. She had spent the previous 2 months watching a legal process determine the facts of her mother's death and the culpability of her father. She stood without notes. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping and without losing the thread and without her voice breaking, which is not something that should be mistaken for the absence of grief but should be understood, by everyone who has spent time thinking about this story, as exactly what it was, the presence of something stronger than grief, something that Diana Calloway had spent 17 years putting into her daughter without fully knowing she was doing it, something that Madison had been building from the inside out all her life in the specific way that children of extraordinary parents sometimes build things without realizing the raw material they are working with. She talked about her mother. She talked about what Diana had built and what it had cost her to build it. She talked about coming home from school when she was 10 years old and finding her mother at her desk at 9 in the evening eating a sandwich over a contract because she had not had time to sit down for dinner and she had a deadline and she was going to meet the deadline because she always met her deadlines, because that was who she was, because the people who trusted her deserved nothing less. She talked about the way Diana had taught her, before Madison understood that she was being taught anything, that the most important thing you could ever do was prepare. Not react. Not hope. Prepare. And then she turned and looked at her father and she said, without raising her voice, that he had thought he was taking something from her mother. She told him that he was wrong. She told him that he had given it to her. She told him that everything Diana had built was now hers, and that she was going to spend the rest of her life making sure it grew, and that every single year it grew and every single person it employed and every single client it served would be her mother, alive in the only way that mattered now, in the work and in the legacy and in the name on the door that was going to stay there. She told him to hold on to that. She told him she wanted him to know that. And then she stepped away from the podium and she sat down and the courtroom remained quiet for a long moment before anyone moved. Robert Calloway received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is serving that sentence. His one filed appeal was denied. He has made no public statement about Diana, about Madison, about the company, or about what he believed was going to happen when he sent that text from her phone on a Saturday morning in November 2015 and drove home and answered the door with the composed expression of a man who had done what he came to do and was ready to collect what he had decided was his. He has had no contact with Madison and Madison has sought none. Madison Calloway took operational control of Calloway Creative Solutions on the day of her 19th birthday. She retained every single member of staff. She hired a senior leadership team to run the day-to-day operations while she completed her degree at Ohio State, the same university her mother had attended, the same business administration program, the same campus where Diana had walked across a graduation stage alone in 1993 with no one in the bleachers holding a sign with her name on it. Madison graduated with her name on a sign, held by Carol Jenkins, who was there with a group of Diana's former colleagues and friends who had made sure that when Madison crossed that stage there was no shortage of noise from the people who loved her. In the year Madison turned 21 she established the Diana Calloway Foundation with the specific mission of providing legal and financial planning resources to women who are in the process of leaving or protecting themselves from financially controlling or dangerous domestic situations. The foundation has helped hundreds of women do exactly what Diana did, quietly, legally, without confrontation, by using the mechanisms of the legal system to place what matters beyond the reach of the person who intends to take it. It is, in every meaningful sense, Diana's work continuing. The company has grown. A second office has opened. New clients have been added. Regional business publications have covered Madison's leadership with the specific kind of coverage that comes when a story is both professionally impressive and personally extraordinary, which this one is on both counts. Diana's name is still on the door of every office. That was the first operational decision Madison made. Not a business decision. A statement. The name stays because the name is not branding. The name is accountability. The name is a woman who built something real and whose daughter intends to keep building it in a way that makes the original worth everything it cost. Here is what this story keeps asking of me every time I think about it, and I have thought about it many times in the process of bringing it to you today. Robert Calloway was not stupid. He was not reckless. He did not act in a moment of rage or passion or confusion that swept him somewhere he had not intended to go. He planned. He calculated over a period of years. He concealed, he managed, he performed, and he executed. He thought he understood the situation he was in. He thought he knew every variable. And he was wrong in a way that was absolute and irreversible, and he was wrong because there was one variable he had never accounted for, which was Diana herself. Not Diana as an obstacle, not Diana as an asset, not Diana as anything connected to his own calculations and his own trajectory and his own sense of what he was owed by a life that had not given him what he wanted. Diana as herself. Diana as a woman who had spent 20 years operating from the inside out, who had built everything she had through the accumulation of small correct decisions made in sequence over a long period of time, who had learned that the most powerful thing you can do in any situation is prepare before the situation requires you to respond. He had never accounted for that Diana because he had stopped seeing her as a person years before he committed the crime. He had turned her into a symbol, into a means to an end, into a problem that needed solving. And in doing so, he had made the fundamental error that undid everything. He had underestimated her. Not her anger, not her suspicion, not her legal recourse. Her preparation. Her quiet, methodical, legally binding, completely invisible preparation. She had changed the entire outcome of the story months before the story reached its worst moment. She had done it with paperwork and attorney meetings and patient attention to detail. She had done it alone, in offices he never entered, with professionals he never met, putting in place structures he did not know existed. She had done it without shouting and without warning and without giving him a single opportunity to see it coming and respond. She had been, in the most practical and consequential sense, 10 moves ahead of him on a board he did not know they were both playing on. There is something in this story that I think is worth naming clearly before we close, because I think it can get lost in the crime and the trial and the verdict and all of the procedural drama that surrounds cases like this one. Diana Calloway did not win. She is gone. Her daughter grew up without her mother from the age of 17. The employees of Calloway Creative Solutions lost a leader who was, by every account that exists, genuinely exceptional. Carol Jenkins lost her closest friend of 22 years. The people who loved Diana lost Diana, and no legal outcome and no foundation and no growth in company revenue and no amount of justice served by a verdict changes that loss or makes it smaller or gives anyone who cared about her back the thing they are missing when they sit down to a holiday table or pick up the phone to call someone who is no longer there to answer. What Diana did was protect her daughter and protect her life's work and ensure that the man who destroyed her was not able to also profit from destroying her. That is not winning. That is the best available outcome inside a situation that should never have existed. It is extraordinary. It is worth honoring. And it is also a tragedy that it was necessary, that Diana spent the last 2 years of her life in the quiet ongoing work of protecting herself and her daughter from someone who was supposed to be the person protecting them. That is the weight that this story carries that the facts alone cannot fully convey. She should not have had to do any of it. She did it anyway, because she was Diana Calloway, and Diana Calloway prepared. So here is the question I want to leave you with. Diana chose silence. She chose preparation over confrontation, legal action over warning, protection over accusation. And I think about this choice a great deal, because it is the choice that ultimately preserved everything she loved. But it is also the choice that meant she faced whatever happened on the night of November 14th without having said everything she might have said, without having had the conversation with Madison she had been planning to have, without having allowed the people who loved her to understand fully what she was navigating. Do you think she made the right choice? Not in the sense of what produced the better legal outcome, because the legal outcome is clear. But in the human sense. In the sense of what you would want for the people you love if you were in her position. Drop your answer in the comments below because I genuinely want to read it. I read every comment on this channel, and conversations like this one are why we make these videos. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what you think Diana should have done differently, if anything. Tell us what this story makes you think about your own life, the people you trust, the things you have built, the ways you protect what matters to you. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the moment. Hit that button. Turn on the notification bell. Because the next story we are bringing you involves a woman who vanished without a trace for 6 full years while everyone who loved her grieved and moved on and tried to build lives around the shape of her absence. And when she came back, and she did come back, she came back with documentation that put 4 people in prison, including one person so close to the original investigation that when the name was revealed, the detective who had worked the case sat down in his chair and did not speak for several minutes. That story is coming to this channel very soon. You do not want to miss it. We will see you in the next one.